They decided to take a car so as not to delay. Both left the unit, but they had not reached the address until that moment and realized that the place of the appointment was a rather remote place, considering of course, that in those years there was very little public lighting as well as paved streets. Even so, they arrived in a hurry, not caring about the conditions of the road. When they were arriving, they noticed that lady was already waiting for them. They were so happy that they began to agree on who would accompany the lady first. The lucky one was Victor's partner, whom we will call Manuel. She, from a distance, made a sign to them where they should go. She is always ahead and signaled for them to follow her. The road began to stop being passable for the car, since it began to have difficulty entering, since the road was such a narrow gap in which the car barely passed. Further on a ravine began, and the lady, making signs, motioned to follow her all the way in until she was out of sight. Manuel asked her to leave the lights of the car on, so they could go down and see where the lady had been broadcast, since it was a very dark place. "I go first, you wait from here, and then I leave, and if you dare, then you go later," smiling at him as if already taking his great conquest for granted. Victor had no choice but to wait in the car and see his friend get lost in the ravine, who was already more than ready for his romance. It didn't take long and he began to feel a slight movement, which made him sink into the back of the car, but he didn't give it importance. Seconds later, another, louder movement reverberates throughout the unit. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw a dog sitting to the side. He did not give it importance either, since he assumed that the animal was approaching with the intention of lying down and that had caused the movements of the cart, but what he thought felt a great shake that made him look again at the dog was already walking, his two hind legs leaning back in the car. As they exchanged glances through the rearview mirror, the dog let her see his teeth. It seemed as if he were growling at him, and his eyes lit up like burning embers, which shone perfectly in the darkness. Victor felt a terrible chill run through his body. He instinctively started the car to get out of the dark gap, but at that moment he also remembered his friend who had gone after that lady, didn't he? He wanted to leave it to his fate, so he began to whistle repeatedly. Soon he saw his friend coming out of the ravine quickly, pulling up his pants. Without saying a word, he got into the car and, as best he could, ranko. They did not remember the conditions of the road, and as they advanced, they jumped over the stones. They left no matter how difficult the road was, and neither of them commented anything. When they arrived at the place where they worked, they began to change words in dribs and draps. Victor then asked Manuel, "Did it happen, my God?" "Well, it's very pale. I scared you with the beeps of the car." "True, I sure spoiled your romance." Manuel, answering with great difficulty, said, "No, it's that when I got to where the lady was, who by the way was already waiting for me, I began to hug her, but she didn't speak. It seemed a little strange to me, since everything I asked about her she answered me with a yes or one, but well, I got carried away and I didn't care. And the beginning of the dress, she did not put up any resistance, so I assumed that everything was fine. At that, she began to undress by herself, and when she was about to drop the clothes turned over and turned their backs on me. I started to take off my pants and lowered my gaze to unzip. When I looked up, I could see the last garment of that lady falling. Although this was not a lady, what I saw in front of me was the back of a mule. I was petrified as I saw those wide buttocks and that big tail swinging like a pendulum, which repeatedly came back in my face. I was about to lose consciousness and my vision became blurred and I was short of breath. I was going to fall when I started listening. The beeps of the car and the roar of the engine, that was what allowed me to react and run away, pulling up my pants. You, Victor, knowing what was happening, right? That's why Spirit and Peter were there, so that he would react. No, Victor, then I answer, no, I'm scared of a dog that was in the middle of the car and that started walking in 2 kicks. When I looked in the rearview mirror, he leaned back in the trunk and showed me his teeth as if he believed me, but also at the same time it seemed that he was making fun of me. His eyes lit up like embers and I panicked, so I started to start the car, but I remembered you, so I started beeping for you to hurry up because I didn't want to leave you alone. I had no idea what was going on with that lady. Both were frustrated and frightened and had a hard time accepting what had happened to them. They even stopped for a while how in love they were. Some time later, Victor stopped making in those offices and left for the north. Nothing more was heard of his other friend. According to many people, he says that this happened to him so that they would learn to respect women because they only make them fall in love, go and soon forget about them. Some others think that it happened to them at the request of a woman who they excited like so many others. What do you think of this? The story I'm going to tell you happened to my father in the 80s. When the plant, which had long been a major source of employment in the community, was already beginning to struggle financially, the workforce preferred to go to work in a paying maquiladora. Essentially the same, only it was a task that required much less effort. Although there were more works, the situation was so bad that the owner himself had to act as a watchman while he got new staff. He and my father were friends and got along very well, so it was no surprise that the day he had an emergency, he called my house to ask my father to make up for that night, assuring him that it would not take long. My father agreed to help him, and that night he went to cover for his friend. The factory is. During the week I found a hill where you could see the rest of the neighborhood. It was spectacular, since it had large cylinders that were full of parea that was transported by long tubes that took them to the truck loading area. These cylinders have side steps made of metal and corridors in which only one person could pass at a time. In the continuous area there was a boiler where he melted material that was emptied into a container that was lifted, and later the material was deposited in the thick tubes that ended in other cylinders. However, much of the machinery had begun to be sold and only the most essential was found. The office was in the hangar with the few pipes he still had left. My father went in and found a note from his friend telling him where the things he was going to need were, as well as the schedules for the rounds. My dad said that in that place silence reigned and it was a bit scary because of the gigantic cylinders that surrounded it. The structure of the office was somewhat small. It only had 2 desks, a refrigerator, a coffee maker, a neon lamp, and a fairly old radio. After his friend called to make sure he had found everything, my dad turned on the radio. Everything was going well until about 3 in the morning, when the radio frequency began to receive interference. My father got up from the chairs where he was sitting, tried to move the antenna, but the volume began to rise without him moving the knob between the static. It seemed to hear the wails of some person. He tried to turn it off, but the button was stuck and the volume was increasing until suddenly the entire factory was swallowed up in the shadows, believing that something had happened in the fuselage box. He went out with the lamp in hand to check. To get there, he had to cross the cauldron area. His footsteps echoed, and despite the fact that it was summer, the cold in that area was particular, which was becoming more and more predominant. He could feel as if someone was watching him. From one of the passageways above him, when he tried to use that area, the lamp began to flicker and then a rumble made him jump. This was because the radio that was in the office turned on and the static echoed. The strange thing about it is that the electricity had not yet returned. Again the noise was heard, and although the lamp does not want to be used, I can see a shadow of a person running in the passageway. The 2 connected with the cylinders on the outside, thinking he was a thief. He ran after him only to see him fall into the cauldron. The smell of burning flesh filled his nostrils, and the man's screams bounced off the walls of the mine. The impact was such that when he tried to call his friend he dropped his cell phone and could no longer find it because the lamp had gone out completely. He ran to the office and, his hands trembling like the desk phone, he called the police to report the event. He had barely hung up when he began to hear slow, slurred footsteps that they could still be heard with the radio on. Frightened, thinking that he might be the thief's accomplice, he hid under the desk. From his hiding place he could hear how they tried to force the door of the office. I was shaking, and my dad, who was not a religious man, started praying as office costs were starting to fall from all sides. On the radio he could hear someone's wail getting clearer and clearer, and just as the door opened he could see the lights of the patrol car reflected off the wall. At that moment my dad screamed for help and the policeman entered the place pale as a leaf. They didn't last a minute inside because the smell was so nauseating that they didn't take even 2 steps when they started vomiting. My father says that the rest of the night was spent in the parking lot at the front until dawn. Between conversations they finally dared to tell what they had seen. After my dad told them what he had seen, one of the policemen told him that the reason he had vomited was not just because of the aroma, but just when they arrived they saw the figure of a burned man. The tea was blistered from the scorched black skin and was pounding on the door hard. When they felt the lights on the volt, they could see that all the skin was melted, with empty eye sockets and pieces of flesh hanging down, revealing parts of the exposed jaw. The image lasted a couple of seconds and then disappeared. They couldn't believe what they had seen, so they asked my dad what better. He stayed outside. Who knows what would have happened if he had stayed inside the factory, and at noon his friend stopped by to leave my dad's cell phone and told him everything that had happened. His friend apologized and told him the real reason why he had asked for the favor. This was because he was going to attend the wake of an employee who did not pay attention to the accusations, who had an accident and died when he slipped when he fell into a lit cauldron. They tried to get it out, but there were explosions that caused the liquid to splashed in such a way that no one could get it out in time. After this, the factory collapsed, and after a month it was closed, and logically the Watchmen never worshipped. To this day you can see how little was left of what it once was. Many tried to enter to steal only to get out terrified of the fright. They say that even among the twisted tubes and rusty beams that once supported the main building, there is a figure that walks slowly as if dragging its feet.